My husband confessed after 15 years of marriage. I love your sister. We've been together for 3 years. But I quietly made one phone call. An hour later, my sister opened the door and turned pale. Good day, dear listeners. It's Louisa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always say you never see it coming. I used to think that was just something people told themselves afterward. A comfortable lie to explain why they didn't act sooner. Now I know it's true. Not because the signs weren't there, but because when they come from the two people you trust most in the world, your brain simply refuses to read them correctly. My name is Rachel. Rachel Haynes, well, Haynes Mercer, after 15 years of marriage to Daniel. We lived in a 4-bedroom colonial in Naperville, Illinois, the kind of house you see on real estate websites next to words like family ready and move-in condition. We had a golden retriever named Biscuit, a shared Netflix queue, and a Sunday morning ritual of coffee and the Tribune crossword. We had 2 kids, Mason, 12, and Lily, 9. We had, as far as I understood the word, a life. I worked as a senior compliance officer at a mid-sized financial firm downtown. Daniel was a structural engineer. We weren't flashy people. We weren't unhappy people. We were the unremarkable, comfortable kind of married that most couples quietly aspire to and rarely discuss at dinner parties because it doesn't make a good story. My sister Claire was 4 years younger than me and lived 20 minutes away in Oak Park. She'd been divorced for 3 years. Her ex-husband Greg had left her for a colleague, which had made Claire briefly sympathetic, and then, gradually, someone who required a great deal of emotional management. She called often. She dropped by unannounced. She had opinions about my furniture, my parenting, my career choices, and my haircuts. I loved her the way you love a complicated piece of your own history, not always comfortably, but without question. The first sign I dismissed as nothing came 18 months before everything fell apart. Daniel had started going to the gym on Saturday mornings, which was new, but not alarming. What was slightly odd was that he'd shower there instead of at home. When I mentioned it casually, he said the locker rooms had better water pressure. I laughed. We moved on. Then came the phone. Daniel had always been relaxed about his phone. He'd leave it on the kitchen counter, forget it in the car, hand it to Mason to look something up. Sometime around the 2nd year, that changed. The phone went everywhere with him. Bathroom, garage, to bed, face down on the nightstand. I noticed. The way you notice a piece of furniture has been moved slightly. Something is different, but you can't quite name it. Claire started being unavailable. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the accumulated small way that is only obvious in hindsight. Texts unanswered for half a day when she used to reply in minutes. Canceled plans with thin excuses. A new vagueness about how she was spending her weekends. I'd assumed she was dating someone and didn't want to jinx it. I even felt a small, sisterly warmth at the thought. The two of them had always gotten along. Claire came to our 4th of July cookouts. Daniel helped her move a couch once, drove her to the airport twice. They texted occasionally, the way your spouse and your sibling text. A group thread, a forwarded meme, nothing that required a second glance. Or so I'd believed. The evening everything changed was a Tuesday in March. The kids were at a school event. I'd come home early with a headache and was lying on the couch in the half-dark when Daniel walked in. He didn't notice me at first. He stood in the kitchen doorway looking at his phone with an expression I had never seen on his face in 15 years of marriage. Something private and soft and entirely not mine. He looked up. He saw me, and something shifted in his eyes. He sat down across from me in the armchair, not next to me on the couch where he usually sat. Across from me. The geography of it was the first signal my body understood before my mind did. "Rachel," he said, "there's something I have to tell you." I remember thinking, with the bizarre clarity that sometimes arrives just before catastrophic news, he's been fired, or he's sick, something medical. "I'm in love with Claire." He said it quietly, like it was a fact he was reporting rather than a bomb he was dropping. "We've been together for 3 years. I'm sorry. I'm telling you because it's not something I can keep hiding." The room didn't spin. My hands didn't shake. What happened was stranger than that. Everything became very still and very sharp, and I heard the refrigerator hum from the kitchen and Biscuit's nails on the hardwood upstairs, and I looked at my husband's face and understood with absolute clarity that the man sitting across from me was someone I did not, in any meaningful sense, know. 3 years. 96 Saturday morning, gym sessions. 3 years of Claire's new vagueness. 3 years of the phone face down on the nightstand. 3 years of being the only person in this family who wasn't in on it. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I looked at him for a long moment and said very calmly, "Thank you for telling me." And then I picked up my phone and made a call. The call I made that night wasn't to Claire. It was to my friend Donna Prescott, who had been a family law attorney for 14 years and who had, by a coincidence that would soon feel more like providence, handled her own sister's brutal divorce 4 years prior. She picked up on the second ring. "I need to talk to you," I said. "Not tomorrow, tonight." She heard something in my voice that I hadn't yet fully heard myself. "I'll put the kettle on," she said. Daniel was still sitting in the armchair when I came downstairs with my coat. He looked at me with the expression of a man who expects a scene and is mildly confused that one hasn't materialized. "Where are you going?" "Out," I said. I drove to Donna's house in Elmhurst on autopilot, which is dangerous and which I don't recommend. What I remember of the drive is the green glow of traffic lights on wet asphalt, and the radio playing something I couldn't name, and the peculiar sensation of feeling nothing and everything simultaneously, like standing in a room where all the walls have been removed and the wind is coming from every direction at once. Donna's kitchen was warm. She sat me down and poured tea I didn't touch and listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay. First question. Do you have a joint account?" That question did more to bring me back to earth than anything else could have. Because it was the right question. Not "how are you feeling," which was unanswerable, but "what is your exposure," which was something concrete. We had a joint checking account and a joint savings account. We had a mortgage in both names. We had 2 retirement accounts, individually held, and a joint brokerage account that Daniel managed. I knew the approximate numbers. I was a compliance officer. I understood financial instruments. The bitter irony was that I had trusted Daniel with our investment account because he'd expressed interest in managing it, and I'd thought, generously, stupidly, that shared responsibility meant shared investment in our future. "Don't touch the accounts," Donna said. "Not yet. Document everything first." I sat in her kitchen until nearly midnight, and by the time I left, the grief had not diminished. It was still there, enormous and waiting. But alongside it, something else had taken shape. Not anger, exactly. Something colder than anger. Something that required a spreadsheet. The losses I counted on the drive home were not only financial, though those were real enough. 15 years of building a life that had been, for at least 3 of them, partly fictional. 2 children who would now experience the particular damage of a fractured family. A relationship with my sister, my only sibling, that was, as of that Tuesday evening in March, over. A self-image as a perceptive, intelligent woman who understood the people around her, which had just been comprehensively dismantled. And the fear. I want to be honest about the fear, because I've heard women in my situation described afterward as warriors or forces of nature, and that framing, while flattering, erases the part where you sit in a parked car in your own driveway at midnight and shake. I was afraid of being alone at 41. I was afraid of what the divorce would do to Mason and Lily. I was afraid of the financial unknown. I was afraid of what my colleagues would think, my neighbors, my parents. My parents, who adored Daniel and who would have to be told. But fear, I had learned from compliance work, is information. It tells you where the vulnerabilities are. And once you know where the vulnerabilities are, you can build protections around them. I went inside, checked on the children, and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and a yellow legal pad. I made 3 columns: assets, risks, actions required. I worked until 2 in the morning. By the time I went to bed, in the guest room, the door locked. I had the beginning of a plan. The plan had several components. The first was documentation. I needed evidence, not just Daniel's confession, which was verbal and which he could walk back. The second was financial. I needed to understand exactly what was in that brokerage account and whether anything had been moved. The third was legal. I needed to formally engage Donna not as a friend, but as my attorney, which required a retainer and a conversation about strategy. The fourth component, the one I didn't write down on the legal pad because writing it felt premature, almost superstitious, was about Claire. Because Claire wasn't just the other woman. She was my sister. She had sat at my Thanksgiving table with my children. She had been in the delivery room when Lily was born. She had known every vulnerable thing about me for 41 years and had used that knowledge, apparently, to conduct a 3-year affair with my husband under my nose. What do you do with that? What court? What legal document? What financial settlement addresses the specific weight of that particular betrayal? I didn't know yet, but I was going to find out. The next morning, I made breakfast for the kids as usual. I packed Mason's lunch. I reminded Lily about her science project. Daniel came downstairs and looked at me with the careful expression of a man navigating unexploded ordnance. I handed him a cup of coffee, said, "Good morning," and went upstairs to make a second call, this time to schedule a formal consultation with Donna in her professional capacity. The plan had begun. Donna's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building on West Monroe, with a view of the Chicago skyline that felt, on that particular Wednesday morning, both beautiful and entirely indifferent to my situation. She had cleared an hour. We used 90 minutes. Illinois is an equitable distribution state, she explained, which I already knew in the abstract, but now needed to understand in the specific. Equitable didn't mean equal. It meant fair, as determined by a judge, accounting for the length of the marriage, each spouse's economic circumstances, contributions to the marital estate, and the needs of minor children. 15 years, 2 children, and a shared brokerage account put me in a reasonably strong position. The affair, while emotionally devastating, had limited legal weight in Illinois divorce proceedings unless it could be tied to financial misconduct. Which was why, Donna said, the brokerage account mattered. "I need you to pull 3 years of statements," she said. "Everything. Don't ask him. Pull them directly from the institution." The brokerage was held at Fidelity, and I was a joint account holder. I had the login credentials. We'd set them up together years ago. I'd simply never used them, deferring always to Daniel's quarterly summaries, which he'd provide over dinner with the confidence of a man who knows you trust him. That night, after the children were in bed and Daniel had retreated to what was now, apparently, his room, I logged in. The account had held, 18 months ago, a little over $340,000, a combination of index funds, individual stocks, and cash. I remembered the number because Daniel had mentioned it at a dinner with friends, proudly, as evidence of responsible long-term planning. The current balance was $241,000. Nearly $100,000 was gone. I sat very still for a long time. Then I took screenshots. Methodical, complete, every page of every statement going back 36 months. I printed them at the office the next morning on a printer I used for client documents, not the shared home printer. I dated and labeled everything. I put the folder in my desk drawer at work, behind a hanging file marked Regulatory Updates Q3, where Daniel would never think to look, even if he ever thought to look at all. It was during this documentation process, 4 days of careful, quiet work, that I noticed the first sign that Daniel was becoming uneasy. He started paying attention to me in a way he hadn't in years. Not affectionate attention, scrutinizing attention. He'd come into a room and glance at what I was doing. He asked twice about my work schedule, which he'd never found interesting before. He suggested with studied casualness that we probably needed to talk more about the situation. I gave him nothing. I was pleasant, routine, present. I made dinners, attended Lily's piano recital, responded to work emails at the kitchen table. I was performing normalcy with the precision of a woman who had spent her career identifying when someone was hiding something and had finally turned that skill inward. Claire called on Thursday. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message, careful, slightly too composed, saying she'd heard things were difficult and that she wanted me to know she loved me. I listened to it once. I did not call back. I saved the voicemail. The proof I'd been waiting for came on a Saturday. I had driven the children to a birthday party in Wheaton and was not expected home for 3 hours. On impulse, or what felt like impulse but was perhaps something more deliberate that I hadn't acknowledged to myself, I returned home after 45 minutes, telling Mason and Lily I'd forgotten something. Daniel's car was in the driveway. He'd said he had a site visit. I let myself in through the garage door quietly, which required no particular stealth because the house alarm was disarmed, which meant someone had let themselves in recently or the code had been shared. They were in the kitchen. Claire was sitting on my kitchen counter. She and Daniel were standing close, speaking in low voices, and there was a familiarity to the physical space between them, the ease of it, the ownership, that told me, more clearly than anything else could have, how thoroughly and how long this had been happening. They heard me come in. The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence, the kind that confirms, without ambiguity, everything. Claire's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: shock, guilt, and then, and this I noted carefully, filed it, used it later, calculation. She wasn't only embarrassed, she was thinking. "Rachel," she started. "You should go," I said. I wasn't shaking. I was, in fact, very calm, with the calm of someone who has already done all the feeling they need to do for this particular revelation and has moved on to the next phase. She left. Daniel stood in the kitchen looking at me. "That wasn't," he started. "I know what it was," I said. I set my keys on the counter, walked upstairs, and texted Donna a single word: confirmed. We were past the point of return. The documentation was solid. The financial irregularities were on record. The physical evidence was witnessed by me in my own home. Now came the part where I acted. Donna filed the divorce petition on a Monday morning, 3 weeks after Daniel's confession. I had signed the documents the previous Friday in her office, with Mason and Lily at school and Daniel at work, and the city carrying on outside the 14th floor window with its complete and merciful indifference. The petition cited irreconcilable differences. Donna's advice, tactical. In Illinois, fault wasn't required, and invoking it rarely improved outcomes. What mattered was the financial record, the asset documentation, and the parenting plan, all of which we had prepared with the thoroughness of people who understood that paper trails are the architecture of justice. Daniel was served at his office on Monday afternoon. He called me 4 times between 3 and 6 o'clock. I didn't answer. At 6:15, he came home and stood in the kitchen, the same counter where I had found them, and his face had reorganized itself from shock into something harder. "You could have talked to me," he said. "I believe you talked to me approximately 6 weeks ago," I said. "I'm talking to you now, through the appropriate channels. You went to an attorney without even—" "Daniel." I kept my voice level. "You've been conducting a 3-year affair with my sister. There is no version of this conversation where I owed you a preview of my legal strategy." He left the house that night. He went, and I would confirm this later through channels I will explain, to Claire's house in Oak Park. That was when the first campaign began. It started with Claire. She appeared at my door 2 days after the filing, on a Wednesday evening, while the children were upstairs doing homework. She had clearly thought about what to wear and what to say. She looked subdued, careful, a studied version of remorseful. I stood in the doorway and did not invite her in. "I know you're angry," she said. "I understand. But we need to talk about what you're doing, Rachel. This is going to destroy the family. Mom and Dad are not a bargaining chip," I said. "I'm not bargaining. I'm asking you to think about the kids, about what a public legal battle does to them. Daniel and I—" She paused, and for a moment, the careful composure slipped just slightly, and I saw something impatient beneath it. "We didn't plan for this to happen." 3 years is a long time to not plan something," I said. She left without getting what she came for. The second approach was Daniel, and it was less gentle. 3 days later, on a Saturday morning, while I was returning from dropping the kids at a friend's house, he called, not from his cell, from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, his voice was very different from the measured, apologetic tone of the previous weeks. "I've talked to a lawyer," he said. "You should know that the brokerage account was managed with your implicit consent. You never objected to my management decisions. That's going to be very hard to argue around." I had expected this. Donna had expected this. It was a legitimate legal argument, and it was also the argument of a man who understood that I had seen the statements and was trying to get ahead of the narrative. "That conversation is between our attorneys," I said, and hung up. The third attempt was the one I hadn't anticipated. 1 week after the filing, I received an email from a personal address I didn't recognize. The message was brief. It said that if I pushed the financial inquiry, certain information about my own professional conduct at the firm would be brought to the attention of my employer. I read it twice. I forwarded it immediately to Donna. I then called our IT security director at work, a woman named Sandra, who owed me a professional courtesy after I'd quietly protected her department in a compliance review 2 years prior, and asked her to document the email's origin for potential legal use. Sandra did not ask why. The threat was hollow. My professional record was 15 years of meticulous, documented work. But the attempt itself told me something important. They were frightened. Frightened people make clumsy moves, and clumsy moves leave evidence. They had, in that email, made a significant mistake. This constitutes attempted intimidation in connection with pending litigation, Donna told me when I came in the following Monday. "We're going to keep this. We're going to let them worry about it." I handled all of it. And then, because Donna had told me to, and because I am a person who occasionally follows good advice, I took 4 days. I drove to my friend Karen's lake house in Wisconsin, 2 hours north, and I sat on a porch over water that was still half frozen with spring, and I let myself be sad. Not performing sadness for an audience, not managing grief into usefulness. Just the plain, physical weight of having loved a family for 15 years and watching it disassemble. I called my parents. That conversation was hard in the specific way that conversations are hard when you love people and must disappoint their image of your life. My mother cried. My father, who had trusted Daniel with his daughter, went very quiet. But when I drove back to Naperville on Thursday afternoon, I was ready. The temptation, when it came, was not what I had expected. I had steeled myself against anger, against Daniel appearing at the door in fury, against Claire calling with threats. What I had not steeled myself against was Daniel being kind. He called on a Sunday evening in April, 2 weeks after I'd returned from Wisconsin, while I was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing Lily's math homework. His voice, when I answered, had shed the defensive edge of recent weeks. He sounded like himself, or rather, he sounded like the person I had believed him to be for the first 12 years, before everything. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the kids, about what we're doing to them. Mason hasn't been sleeping. Did you know that? He told me when I had them last weekend." I did know. I had been watching Mason with the careful attention of a mother who understands that children register seismic damage in ways they can't yet name. He'd been quieter, yes. He'd stopped watching TV after dinner and started going straight to his room. "I know," I said. "What if we tried mediation first?" Daniel's voice was careful, reasonable, the voice of a structural engineer who has assessed a failing load and is proposing a solution. Not to save the marriage, I understand that's not on the table, but to make this cleaner, less adversarial. For the kids. Was he wrong? Was mediation less adversarial? In the abstract, perhaps. But this was not an abstract situation. This was a man who had, 2 weeks prior, allowed the transmission of an intimidating email suggesting professional misconduct. This was a man who had been concealing nearly $100,000 in asset transfers, which Donna's forensic review was still unraveling. This was a man who was now, apparently, appealing to my maternal instincts because his legal position was weakening. Could you blame me for wondering, for just one moment, whether he meant it? "I'll mention it to Donna," I said. I did. She noted it. We did not pursue it. Claire's attempt was more oblique. She sent flowers, not to the house, but to my office. Tulips, my favorite, which she knew. The card said simply, "I miss you." I know I don't deserve to say that. I looked at the flowers for a long moment. Then I put them in the kitchen, where the whole office could see them, and thought about them as little as possible. I did not respond to the card. I did, however, note the delivery date and time in the folder labeled Regulatory Updates Q3, alongside the intimidation email and the fidelity screenshots. What Claire had calculated, correctly I think, was that the flowers were the kind of gesture that would make me look petty if I complained about it and soften me if I didn't. It was a small, elegant form of manipulation, and I found myself, despite everything, grimly admiring its architecture. But admiring a trap and walking into it are different things. Daniel and Claire spent those weeks, I would learn later, watching me, trying to read my movements, gauge my timeline, assess my strategy. They had their own attorney now, a man named Kowalski, who had a reputation for aggressive negotiation. This I knew from Donna. The legal machinery was in motion on both sides, and what my antagonists were hoping, I believe, was that time and pressure would erode my resolve, that I would accept a settlement, that the emotional weight would eventually prove heavier than the fight. They had miscalculated the relationship between weight and resolve. Sometimes weight is what sharpens you. The social support came from 3 directions, and I want to be accurate about it because it mattered more than I had anticipated. The first was Donna, not just as an attorney, but as a friend who called on Tuesday evenings to ask how I was doing, not as a client, but as a woman. The second was Karen, whose lake house had held me together in Wisconsin and who now drove down to Naperville twice in April, brought wine, and sat with me in the kitchen after the children were asleep and let me say the things I couldn't say in daylight. The third was a woman I hadn't expected, my colleague Janet, who had gone through her own divorce 6 years prior and who pulled me aside one afternoon after a staff meeting and said quietly, "I hear things. You're handling it well, and you're going to be fine." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. I want to name something here that I think is often omitted from stories like mine. The ordinary people who hold you together are not dramatic figures. They don't make speeches. They bring coffee and ask normal questions and let you be a complicated human being in the middle of a complicated situation. And that plainness is a form of love that is harder to replace than almost anything else. I was not alone. I had been afraid that I would be, and I wasn't. And that distinction was the difference between surviving and collapsing. The spring moved on. April became May. The legal process ground forward with its own cold momentum, and Daniel and Claire, watching from their respective distances, began to understand that I was not softening. They would need to try something else. They came together. That was the part I hadn't expected. The coordination of it. The degree of planning it implied. It was a Saturday in mid-May, 3 months after the filing, and the children were with Daniel for the weekend, as per the temporary custody arrangement. I was alone in the house for the first time in weeks, genuinely alone, cleaning out the hall closet with the focused purposefulness of a woman converting grief into square footage. The doorbell rang at 10 in the morning, both of them. Daniel on my porch, Claire 1 step behind him, slightly to his left, in the configuration of people who have rehearsed their blocking. "We'd like to talk," Daniel said. "That's all. Just talk." I looked at them. I thought of 6 things in rapid succession. Then I opened the door. I will explain the decision. Letting them in was information gathering, and I wanted to hear what they had prepared. I sat in the armchair, the same armchair where Daniel had delivered his confession, and I let them take the couch together. The physical staging of it was almost interesting. 2 people who had conducted a clandestine affair in the borrowed geography of my life, now sitting openly on my furniture, as though normalcy were available to them by request. Daniel spoke first. His tone was the mediated version, the reasonable man voice, and he had clearly worked on it. "We know this has been devastating," he began. "We're not here to minimize that. We're here because we're genuinely worried about the kids, about your well-being, about what a prolonged legal fight will cost everyone, not just financially." He looked at me steadily. "Rachel, you're going to win something. You probably know that. But at what cost? Mason is already struggling. Lily cried at drop-off last week. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to worry you, but she's crying at school. Is that worth—" "Don't," I said. He stopped. "Using my children as levers in your argument is not going to work," I said. "I know my children. I am managing their well-being. I am also managing this legal process. Those 2 things are not in conflict." There was a pause. Then Claire leaned forward, and her voice shifted. Lower, more intimate. The voice she used when we were teenagers, and she wanted to borrow something I wasn't inclined to lend. "Rach," she said, "I know you're angry at me. I deserve it. But can you put that aside for a minute? Just as a practical matter? Because what Kowalski is telling Daniel, and I know this, I'm not supposed to say it, but I'm telling you, is that there are ways this case could go that would not be good for you. The asset question has another reading. If Daniel's attorney argues implied consent and management discretion, then Donna will argue marital waste with a forensic accounting report," I said. "I know." Claire's expression shifted. The softness retracted. The calculation I had seen on her face in the kitchen months ago returned, and it occurred to me in that moment, sitting in my own armchair in my own house on a Saturday morning, looking at my only sister, that I had spent most of my adult life slightly afraid of displeasing her, making space for her, managing her, not out of weakness, but out of an idea of what love required. "You always have to be the smart one," Claire said, and her voice was no longer low or intimate. Even now after everything, you can't just let something be without turning it into a project, a strategy." "You had an affair with my husband," I said. "Excuse me for strategizing." Daniel put his hand on Claire's arm. She shook it off. "Here's what I'll tell you," she said, and the mask was entirely gone now, and what was underneath it was neither guilty nor remorseful. It was cold, and it was direct, and I believe it was, finally, honest. "If you drag this out, if you make this ugly, I will tell people things about you. Things you told me over the years, about your struggles, your anxieties. Things that would," she paused, choosing, "reframe people's image of you." I let the silence sit for 3 full seconds. "That would be defamation," I said. "Donna would be very interested." I stood up. "I'd like you both to leave now," I said. "The attorneys can communicate through appropriate channels." They left. Not gracefully. Daniel moved quickly, head down, and Claire walked out with the rigid posture of someone containing fury at the precise moment it has been made useless. I stood in the doorway and watched them go to Daniel's car, and I couldn't help hearing, Claire say something sharp and low, and Daniel's short response, and then the car door, and then the engine. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway for a moment with my hand flat against the door, and I will be honest, I was afraid. Not of them, precisely, but of the vastness of what Claire had implied. She knew things, real things, private things, the confided vulnerabilities of a lifetime of sisterhood. She could use them, perhaps not effectively, but enough to cause damage. The fear was real, and it clarified everything. Because the only way to protect yourself from a person who knows your weaknesses is to become someone who is no longer diminished by them. I went back to the closet. I finished cleaning it out. I texted Donna at noon. They came to the house. Together. Claire made an implied threat, personal information as leverage. I stayed calm. "Please note it." Donna responded, "Good. That's 2 now." The deposition was scheduled for a Wednesday in June, in a conference room on the 17th floor of a downtown building 6 blocks from Donna's office. Present, myself, Donna, Daniel, his attorney Kowalski, and a court reporter. Claire was not a party to the divorce proceedings, but she was about to become relevant to them in a way that neither she nor Daniel had anticipated. 3 weeks before the deposition, Donna had filed a motion to introduce evidence of financial misconduct connected to the marital estate. The forensic accounting report, prepared by a CPA Donna regularly retained, had reconstructed the $97,000 in transfers that had left the joint brokerage account over a period of 28 months. The money had not gone to investments. It had not been lost in market corrections. It had been transferred, in increments small enough to avoid automatic flagging, to a savings account in Daniel's name only. And from there, in a pattern that the forensic report laid out with devastating clarity, to a second account that had been opened 9 months prior, jointly, by Daniel and Claire Whitmore. Did they think I wouldn't find the paper trail? Did they believe that because I had trusted him with the account management, I couldn't read a bank statement? The morning of the deposition, I arrived first. I was wearing a gray suit I'd bought specifically for this, not to perform anything, but because the right clothes are a form of self-possession, and I needed all the self-possession I had. I sat at the conference table with a glass of water and reviewed my notes with the composure of a woman who has spent 15 years assessing risk for a living. Daniel arrived with Kowalski. He looked at me, then at Donna, then at the folder in front of Donna, which was thick and tabbed. I watched something move through his expression. Not quite fear, but its structural precursor. Recognition. Kowalski opened with what I had expected. The implied consent argument, the management discretion defense, the framing of Daniel's account transfers as ordinary financial planning. He was polished and confident. He had clearly litigated this type of dispute before. Donna let him finish. Then she opened the folder. She presented the forensic report in sections, with the court reporter capturing every word. Account statements, transfer records. The joint account opened by Daniel and Claire. The $97,000 in traced funds. The dates, beginning, notably, 14 months before Daniel's confession, which meant the financial extraction had begun while the marriage was still, officially, intact and undisclosed. "Mr. Mercer," Donna said, addressing Daniel directly, "can you explain the purpose of the joint account you hold with Ms. Claire Whitmore?" Kowalski put his hand up. "My client." "It's a simple question," Donna said pleasantly. "I'd like it on the record." Daniel's composure had been eroding since the second tab of the folder. By this point, he had stopped maintaining eye contact with anyone. His jaw was set in the specific way of a person who is working very hard to not say anything while also needing to say something. "We'll respond in writing," Kowalski said. "Of course," Donna said. "We'll also be filing this forensic report as Exhibit C to the Asset Disclosure Supplement. The judge will have it by end of week." It was at this moment that Daniel did something neither his attorney nor I had expected. He leaned forward and said, not to Donna, not to the court reporter, but to me, "This is what you wanted. You wanted a reason to blow everything up." I looked at him. I had prepared myself for many things. For his legal arguments, for his attorney's tactics, for the cold machinery of the process. I had not prepared a response for this particular statement because it did not require preparation. "You gave me the reason," I said. "I simply used it." The silence in that room was different from all previous silences in this story. It was the silence of a proceeding from which the pretense has been fully withdrawn. Kowalski requested a recess. He and Daniel stepped into the hallway. Through the glass partition, I could see them. Kowalski speaking rapidly, hand gestures tight and controlled, the body language of an attorney recalibrating under pressure. Daniel stood with his arms crossed, looking at the floor. Donna leaned over and said quietly, "He's going to negotiate." "I know," I said. I drank my water. I looked at the Chicago skyline through the window. Somewhere in Oak Park, Claire was waiting for a call that would tell her how it had gone. I thought of her sitting on my kitchen counter with the ease and ownership of a woman in her own space. I thought of the flowers delivered to my office. I thought of her face in my living room 2 months ago, the mask finally down, the threat issued with the calm of someone who believed knowledge was power. Knowledge was power. That was true. But documented knowledge, in a conference room on the 17th floor, with a court reporter and a forensic accounting report, that was a different category of power entirely. Kowalski and Daniel came back in. Kowalski sat down. "We're prepared to discuss settlement," he said. Settlement discussions in a contested divorce are not a single conversation. They are a process, grinding, methodical, conducted through attorneys in exchanges that lack any of the emotional register of the actual human damage underneath them, which is, in its way, exactly as it should be. I did not want my emotions in that room anymore. I had used them to get to this point. Now, I wanted the law. Donna opened our position without softness. Full marital interest in the family home. Primary physical custody of Mason and Lily with structured parenting time for Daniel. an equitable division of all retirement accounts, and full restitution of the $97,000 in transferred funds, with interest, on the grounds of marital waste. Kowalski countered. He pushed back on the home, on the custody split, on the characterization of the transfers. We had 2 sessions in Donna's conference room over 8 days in late June. I attended both. I said very little and listened to everything. The forensic report was the cornerstone. Kowalski could argue management discretion for the original investments. He could not argue management discretion for transfers into a joint account with a woman who was simultaneously conducting an affair with his client. The paper trail was too clean, the timing too specific, the pattern too deliberate. Even sympathetic framing couldn't hold its shape against 36 months of documented transfers. On the morning of the second session, Kowalski arrived without Daniel. He sat across from Donna and me and spent 45 minutes working through a revised position that represented, if you tracked the numbers from where we'd started, a complete capitulation dressed in the vocabulary of negotiation. Daniel would relinquish his claim to the marital home. The house, the 4-bedroom colonial in Naperville, the place where my children had grown up, where Mason had measured his height on the doorframe and Lily had learned to ride her bike in the driveway, was mine. The $97,000 plus 8% calculated interest for the period of the transfers was to be paid from Daniel's individual accounts within 60 days of final decree. Retirement accounts were divided according to the marriage's equitable share, which, for a 15-year marriage, was favorable. Primary physical custody of Mason and Lily would reside with me. Daniel would have parenting time on alternating weekends and 1 midweek dinner, with a formal right of first refusal for additional time. Both children would continue in their current schools. All major decisions regarding education, healthcare, and religion would require mutual consent, with a dispute resolution mechanism that, practically speaking, meant that if Daniel refused to engage in good faith, the court would simply rule in my favor. I want to say something about that custody arrangement, because I think it is the part of the settlement that mattered most and that is least visible in the numbers. Daniel was not a bad father. He had been a dishonest husband and a disloyal partner, but the record of his parenting was separate from that, and I had been careful, in every conversation with Donna, in every decision I made, not to use the children as instruments of punishment. What I had insisted on was stability, their schools, their routines, their friendships, their sense that the house they came home to was solid and permanent. Primary custody gave me the authority to maintain that stability. The alternating weekends gave Daniel a genuine and structured role in their lives. It was not generous for his sake. It was accurate for theirs. I signed the agreement on a Friday afternoon in early July in Donna's office, with the skyline out the window and a pen that Donna told me she kept specifically for this purpose. Not for celebrations, she said, but for finishes. Finishes. I liked that. Not endings. Finishes. There was one additional matter. The intimidation email, sent from the account we had subsequently traced through Sandra's documentation to a device on Daniel's home network, was submitted to Donna's file as evidence of bad faith litigation conduct. She didn't file it separately. She didn't need to. The threat of its use had been implicit in every session of settlement negotiations, and Kowalski had known it. It had functioned as the kind of leverage that works best when unused. The morning after I signed, I sat in my kitchen, and had coffee in a house that was mine, in a neighborhood I knew, in a life that was fractured but real. Mason was still sleeping upstairs. Lily had spent the night at a friend's house and would be back by noon. I did not feel victorious exactly. That isn't quite the right word. What I felt was solid, like weight had settled back into the floor beneath me, like the walls were load-bearing again. I thought about Claire, which I hadn't allowed myself to do much during the legal process. She was not a party to the divorce. She had no legal exposure in the proceedings, but Daniel's agreement required the closure of the joint account, the return of the transferred funds, and, implicitly, irrevocably, the end of any financial arrangement he had been maintaining with her. Whatever Daniel had promised her, he could not now afford to keep. The settlement had seen to that. Had I wanted to punish Claire? I had asked myself that question many times. The honest answer was yes. And also, I had been careful not to let punishment be the engine of my decisions, because punishment as engine is what makes people take actions they later regret. Every choice I had made had been legally sound, documented, and defensible. If those choices also constituted consequences for Claire, that was simply the natural architecture of cause and effect. I also thought about who I had been on the morning after Daniel's confession. The woman sitting at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and 3 columns, alone in the dark at 2 a.m, shaking and methodical in equal measure. I would not have recognized then the person who sat at this table now, unhurried, clear-eyed, certain of the ground beneath her. That distance between those 2 mornings was the real measure of what had been won. Not the house, not the money, not the custody terms. The distance itself, the fact that I had crossed it. I finished my coffee. I wrote Mason a note for when he woke up. I went for a walk. The summer morning was ordinary and clean, and the neighbors were mowing their lawns, and a sprinkler was running 2 houses down, and everything was the same and entirely different, and that was all right. The year after the divorce was finalized was the year I learned what rebuilding actually looks like, as opposed to what I had imagined it would look like. I had expected it to feel like construction, deliberate, planned, a sequence of steps with visible progress. What it actually felt like was something quieter and stranger, like learning to use a room you'd always walked past, like discovering that the space that had been occupied by grief and vigilance and legal preparation was still there, and still mine, and could now hold other things. I stayed in the Naperville house through the end of the school year for continuity. In September, when Mason started 7th grade and Lily started 4th, I made a decision I'd been turning over since spring. I put the house on the market. Not because I couldn't live there. I had reclaimed it, room by room, through the preceding months. But because I had looked at the 4-bedroom colonial and understood that it was a house built for a version of my life that no longer existed, and that I was allowed to want something that fit the life I was actually living. I bought a 3-bedroom Craftsman in Evanston, 7 blocks from Lake Michigan, with a porch I could see the water from on clear days and a kitchen renovated with the kind of careful attention to detail I found I appreciated more with age. The children helped paint Lily's room, a green she'd chosen from 17 swatches, and Mason asked, with the studied casualness of a 12-year-old who cares more than he'll admit, whether he could have the room with the bigger window. He could. I was promoted at the firm in November, Senior Director of Compliance, a role that had been discussed for 2 years and that I had quietly stopped pursuing during the worst of the crisis because I hadn't had the bandwidth. My manager, Susan, who had known me professionally for a decade, told me during my review that she'd been watching how I'd handled the past year and that it had confirmed what she'd already believed about my capacity under pressure. I didn't explain to her what the past year had actually involved. I simply said, "Thank you." I began seeing a therapist in August, which I should have done sooner, and which I mention here because the omission of therapy from stories like mine strikes me as a kind of dishonesty. You cannot go through what I went through without cost to yourself, and that cost needs somewhere to be processed that is not your children, your attorney, or your friends who have already given generously. Dr. Miriam Satz, on Wednesday afternoons, gave me a space to be something other than competent, and that space turned out to be necessary. I did not date for a long time. I am including this fact without apology or explanation, because it is simply true, and because the pressure women feel to demonstrate their recovery through new romantic attachments is something I find both understandable and exhausting. I had a full life. My children were adjusting, with the resilience of kids who have been spoken to honestly and loved without condition. Mason's sleep had returned to normal by October. Lily had a best friend she talked about constantly. They saw their father on his designated weekends, and I was, in all our exchanges, civil and correct. Because they were watching, and because they would carry the model of those interactions into their own adult lives. Now, for the part I want to tell carefully. Daniel and Claire moved in together in August, 8 months after the divorce was finalized. By the following spring, things between them were reportedly not going well. The financial settlement had stripped Daniel of the cushion he'd been quietly building. Claire, who had supplemented her income in ways that were now no longer available, was under pressure. There was, reportedly, a great deal of fighting. By the summer, 2 years after Daniel's confession, they had separated. I did not feel vindicated. I felt a small and private sadness because these were people I had once loved, but I also felt the particular peace of a person who did not cause this. Their unhappiness was the natural consequence of choices that had predated my legal response by years. I had simply declined to absorb those consequences on their behalf. That is a distinction I think about sometimes, on clear evenings when I sit on my porch in Evanston and I can see the water, and the children are inside, and my life is quiet and mine and real. If this story has a lesson, it's this. Trust your own intelligence. Not to predict betrayal, you can't always see it coming, but to respond to it without surrendering yourself in the process. I didn't win because I was ruthless. I won because I was careful and documented everything and refused to let fear make my decisions. What would you have done? Would you have confronted them first or stayed quiet and planned? I'd genuinely like to know. Leave a comment below. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe for more. Thank you for listening to the end.